Welcome to this session. And actually, this is just part one of our two-part series on the geopolitics. And we have another one on the local perceptions. And I strongly suggest that if you have time, to attend both of the sessions. And I think there's no better time than today to talk about the geopolitics in the Pacific region. And we have seen an intensified geostrategic competition between traditional development partners and China in the region. For example, at the Pacific Island Forum Summit last week, we have seen a large number of the delegations from overseas to Tonga trying to offer assistance to the government and also competing for influence. Another new sign is that for donors from both sides, the traditional demand partners in China, they are trying to expand to the areas, not of their comfort areas. For example, for traditional demand partners, they are doing more and more infrastructure projects. And also for China, they are expanding to the security areas. Yeah, especially the policing cooperation with some of the Pacific Island countries, including Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and more countries to come. And today we are going to focus on 4 of the most important partner countries in the region. And we have the US and Australia, China, and France. So very delighted to have 4 distinguished speakers with us. And in terms of format, each of them, they will have 10 minutes to present. And then we will open the floor. And I will briefly introduce them one by one before they make the presentation. So our first speaker will be Associate Professor Kenneth Kuper, who is not new to us. And Kenneth was involved in 2 sessions yesterday. And Kenneth is Associate Professor at the University of Guam, where he runs the International Relations Research Agenda. And he is also the co-founder of the Pacific Center for Island Security based in Guam, which provides island and also the islander perspectives to the geopolitical maneuvering in the Pacific Islands, especially in Micronesian countries. And he also sits on the government of Guam's Commission on Decolonization, he mentioned yesterday, and he is a main author for the most comprehensive self-determination study for the island to date. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Ken. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you.
I promise this is my last presentation of this event. Thank you for dealing with my presence. I greatly appreciate it. I'm just going to set up the PowerPoint here. That one. Yes. Thank you. So, I'll start my time now. We've been talking about Guam yesterday, but now I want to sort of go to the larger Micronesian region. All right. So, on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, originating from the island of Tinian in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The Enola Gay and the Bockscar, which bombed Nagasaki 3 days later, both launched from Tinian's North Field. After World War II, the U.S. leased about 18,000 acres of Tinian for defense. They kind of just let it sit there for a while. But today, amid rising competition with China, the U.S. plans to reuse these airfields. In 2023, General Kenneth announced efforts to, quote-unquote, reclaim these airfields from the jungle, part of a broader shift in U.S. strategy across Micronesia, focusing on this reclamation of previously mothballed facilities to enable more dispersed operations. So what I'm going to do today is analyze the genealogy of this strategic reclamation and the implications of this reclamation for the security of Micronesia and Micronesians. So Micronesia has long been central to U.S. military planning. During World War II, many parts of Oceania were used, but none more so than Micronesia was important for post-war strategy. The sub-region includes Guam, the CNMI, and the 3 countries in free association with the U.S., Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. Kiribati and Nauru are also geographically part of Micronesia, but share a very different colonial history. So while Guam has been under U.S. control since 1898, the remaining Micronesian islands came under U.S. administration after World War II through the United Nations Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. So after World War II, U.S. strategists saw the Pacific as a quote-unquote American lake, a region of control and dominance. Micronesian islands offered mobile forces and bases for launching offensives. Military planners argued that these island chains should be controlled even if bases were not to be developed. Why? Simply to deny them to others. This would balance military security with domestic concerns in the United States about overspending on base development. After the dissolution of the TTPI, agreements with the CNMI, Palau, the FSM, and the Marshall Islands made the U.S. responsible for their defense and also authorized military installations, effectively achieving what they call strategic denial. While the compacts of free association establish sovereignty for these nations, they also deny third-party military access to FAS land, airspace, or territorial seas. This strategic denial allows the freely associated states to act as buffers between military bases in Guam and East Asia. However, as Tinian's case shows, strategic denial is no longer enough. The U.S. is now planning to actively utilize the islands. In 2020, the United States Air Force ended what they called continuous bomber presence in Guam, marking a strategic shift aligned with the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which prioritized interstate competition over terrorism. This shift necessitated restructuring of the United States forces for 2 things: strategic predictability and operational unpredictability. The core of these concepts is to reduce the vulnerability of U.S. forces and increase their effectiveness against adversaries able to disrupt or deny U.S. control of battle space. A prime example of this shift is the Air Force's agile combat employment, which is designed to increase survivability by dispersing forces, spreading forces out across multiple locations. Instead of concentrating forces in one place, ACE ensures operations can continue from dispersed sites, which ultimately complicates adversaries' targeting. U.S. military emphasis on distribution and dispersal relies on both enduring locations, which support ongoing activities, and contingency locations, which provide temporary support. So this is where we get 2 things the United States seeks: bases and places. And these 2 things are crucial in the strategic maneuver to reclaim Micronesia and prepare the islands for use. To be effective, these islands must be also actively utilized. So understanding the importance of reclaiming Micronesia requires considering Guam's growing vulnerability. For over a century, Guam has been a strategic hub for U.S. military operations, hosting major installations like Andersen Air Force Base. However, Guam's proximity to China has made it a prime target in a conflict, especially from China's advanced missile systems. Missiles like the DF-26 have been dubbed in the media as the Guam killer, which poses a significant threat. And in response, the U.S. military is pushing for enhanced missile defense systems. Yet Guam is increasingly viewed as a potential first line of attack rather than a defensive stronghold. This drives the U.S. military to then seek alternative operating locations across Micronesia. The vulnerability of Guam has led the U.S. military, for example, to develop a divert airfield in Tinian to ensure operational continuity if access to Andersen Air Force is limited or denied. Just think about that for a second. Just in case we can no longer use Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, we'll have other places to operate from. That's very telling when you're actually someone living in Guam. Right? So this airfield will serve as a contingency plan focusing on meeting mission requirements. And the U.S. plans to allocate around $79 million in fiscal year 2024 for airfield developments in Tinian. In Palau, the U.S. military is significantly increasing its presence and including the country in joint exercises. during the Valiant Shield exercise in June 2022 and 23, the U.S. tested the Patriot missile defense system, successfully shooting down a dummy cruise missile. These tests prompted Palau's presidents to advocate for the permanent deployment of the system, asserting that Palau's close relationship with the U.S. makes it a target for potential attacks from China. However, this proposal faces strong opposition from Palau's Senate, reflecting ongoing debates in the country about military developments. President Whip's fear stems from Palau being chosen to host a tactical multi-mission over-the-horizon radar system. To make it easier, it's called TACMOR, which will enhance air domain awareness. This radar system consists of interconnected antennas broadcasting high-frequency signals. The U.S. argues that this system will benefit both Palau and the U.S. by promoting, a tell as old as time, once again, a free and open Indo-Pacific. However, some in Palau resist the radar's construction process. Additionally, the U.S. military is clearing vegetation and building a runway on Peleliu, which many of the island's chiefs support because it will bring joint use to the airfield and expand it. In the Federated States of Micronesia, similar military infrastructure developments are occurring, including ongoing improvements to Yap's airport and seaport, with plans for air defense assets and runway rehabilitation. The U.S. military plans to invest $400 million in these projects, underscoring Micronesia's strategic importance. Although the FSM currently sees less military activity than Palau, its potential role in future U.S. operations remains significant. Former president of the FSM and Senator Peter Christian said, "I doubt very much that China will go to the U.S. and fight a war. I doubt that the U.S. will go to China and start a war, but they may fight here." These developments in Micronesia raise important questions about the security of the islands and our inhabitants. The U.S. military's emphasis on distribution and dispersal involves not just the movement of assets, but also the dispersal of risk. And I think that's something we all need to understand. What is being distributed and dispersed are not just assets, but also risk, spreading out the risk. That's key and critical to what the United States military is trying to do in Micronesia. So as shown in Guam, the presence of the U.S. military inevitably brings targeting risks. For the rest of Micronesia, becoming operational hubs or places for the U.S. military means potentially being drawn into conflicts not of our own making. This dynamic between targeting and deterrence, driven by this spread of risk, will be a key factor in Micronesia's security landscape. The subregion's role in escalating tensions or potential conflict between the United States and China will shape its future security. Yes, climate change is incredibly important, but also we cannot say that geopolitics has no role, because even if we don't care about geopolitics in Micronesia, it surely cares about us, and we cannot ignore it. So in conclusion, the U.S. military's evolving strategy of reclaiming and utilizing facilities in Micronesia marks a significant shift in strategic thinking. The islands of Micronesia are transitioning from being mere buffers in a strategy of strategic denial, I got you, I'm almost done, to becoming key operating locations. This new phase of strategic reclamation presents new challenges and security dilemmas for the region as it navigates its role in the growing competition between the United States and China. Thank you for listening. May Micronesia have a peaceful future, and may Micronesia not fall under a violent geography, and may Micronesia's future be written by Micronesian pens. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your thoughts with us. And our next speaker is Mihai Sara, and Mihai is the Director of Pacific Islands Program at the Law Institute. And this program has policy research focus on contemporary challenges facing the Pacific Island region. And Mihai's research focus is on the regional dynamics and the role of those big countries like US, China, and Australia in the region. And he has published extensively on these topics. And before joining the Law Institute, Mihai was working as an Australian diplomat with postings in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Solomon Islands and Indonesia. So, hand over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Denghua. Can everyone hear me okay? No, I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so you don't have to look at me. You don't even have to listen, but I'll be speaking from some prepared remarks. It was actually surprisingly difficult to decide what to speak about today. My patch, my lane, to use sometimes used terminology, is Australian foreign policy in the Pacific. And I found it impossible to speak about Australian foreign policy in the Pacific without referring to and investigating geopolitical competition. And I found it impossible to do that without referring to and investigating the motivations and the actions of larger powers in the region. So please excuse me if there's some overlap between us as panelists, but obviously all of these issues are interconnected. So what is Australia's foreign policy in the Pacific? There's a really great roundup on the DFAT website if you want to see it. It's a laundry list of Australia seeking to meet a vast range of Pacific Island priorities, strategic imperatives, economic priorities, climate priorities, and so on. I won't go through that laundry list, but let's describe the current context because it critically affects Australia's motivation, resourcing, and focus in the region. Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong said recently, "We are in a state of permanent contest in the Pacific." Now, obviously, that's problematic language, problematic framing. One of the things that's problematic about that is that it is essentially accurate. And it's quite uncommon for someone of Minister Wong's caliber to be that frank and perhaps that crude in her framing of Australia's role, presence, and interest in the region. But let's try to understand a little bit more about what is this contest? Why is it so problematic? The panel later on today will investigate Pacific perspectives, experiences, and reactions to some of this. So I think these are important parts of the same equation. The permanent contest, traditional powers like Australia, the United States, New Zealand, are striving to maintain their influence against the backdrop of deepening and increasing Chinese government, military, security engagement into key sectors, policing, telecommunications, political spheres, infrastructure, and media in the region. There's a shift there. I was asked a few years ago, did Australia drop the ball in the Pacific because Solomon Islands signed a security deal with China? Tricky question, it came from a journalist, of course. A part of that answer is that the security environment in the region changed very, very rapidly. China started behaving in different ways. Of course, it's had a long-standing presence culturally, demographically, ethnically, not just in the Pacific, but in other parts of the world. The change is top-down driven policy change, a reflection of evolving strategic intent in the region. In this backdrop, Pacific countries have become the diplomatic price setters. They retain sovereignty, they retain control and agency. We saw interesting dynamics at the PIF leaders meeting last week. But one key element of this strategic competition is that Pacific leaders are diplomatic price setters. They're no longer having to bang the drum to get attention. If anything, they're having to put up roadblocks and speed bumps to coordinate and slow down that attention. And it gives them increasing leverage, naturally, to maximize development gains for their countries, but also political gains for themselves. This unbridled rivalry, therefore, presents challenges to good governance and transparency in the region. Local political actors, in some contexts, have been quite assertive, perhaps cynical, in exploiting this interest to advance their own national interests, their own national political interests. Essential priorities like health and education are, to some degree, being sidelined in favor of local political and therefore great power interest in infrastructure. We're seeing stagnating or declining human development indicators around the region. It takes different forms in different countries, of course. Now, the Pacific is unique as a region. Everyone here knows that, but it is not alone in the world in experiencing this intensifying competition. And it's really important to step outside of our national context and outside of our regional context to consider and appreciate the global tectonic forces in play. The world is experiencing visible friction between the United States and China. Those are two large political and strategic entities, but it goes deeper than that. This is a contest not just for where you can put your ships and your soldiers and your missiles. That's a huge element of it, but it's also a contest for values, for global governance, for norms of acceptable behavior, for framing of issues such as human rights. Are human rights something connected to economic development, or are they universal freedoms? That contest plays out very visibly as China seeks to change language in international settings, seeks to gain political endorsement for statements that reflect its version of global norms, norms that are more accommodating to its governance style, more accommodating to its strategic interests. Of course, this has drawn a counter-reaction from those entities seeking to preserve that status quo. Before I go too much further, I want to say I don't endorse this competition, but I think it's imperative to be clear-eyed about what's driving it and to try to understand how Australia, individual Pacific countries, civil society, academia, and so on, how we all fit into that, what we can push back on, what we need to buttress, and where the opportunities for radical change in the status quo are. It's not sufficient to preserve the status quo, for example, between Australia and Pacific country relations, just because that's under threat from China. It's also an opportunity to do better in a lot of ways. And if I don't get talked off the stage, we can explore how Australia has sought to take this moment in time to elevate its offering to Pacific countries, to rebalance as much as possible bilateral relations so that they are partnerships, not donor-beneficiary relations. That's easier said than done, but there are examples where it's working. The strategic interest of great powers, we had a terrific presentation from Kenneth that lays out essentially the logic of this contest. It's a combination of rivalries, geography, resource access. There's also diplomatic advantage and historical legacy. It plays out in different ways in different countries. Pacific countries have vast exclusive economic zones. They're situated along key maritime routes. They encompass globally valuable assets, fisheries, minerals, under the sea, on land, and so on. Maritime domain awareness. It's both a national security need for Pacific Island countries, it's also a strategic need for larger powers. It just is. Control over transport routes, reliable access to territories, to passage through territories, laneways, access and influence over telecommunications, infrastructure are of strategic importance. 2 minutes? I've got like 10 pages. These are the wants that larger countries have in the region. When they're threatened, it becomes a national security concern for those larger countries. When they're not threatened, they don't need to seek additional security agreements. They don't need to elevate security cooperation. They don't need to build military installations or places. But when they are threatened, there's a response. So that's the context. Security cooperation. From Australia, we've seen a huge uplift in traditional development sector funding, of course. We've seen a huge uplift in infrastructure provision. We've seen new visa classes to enable stronger community ties between Australia and individual Pacific countries. The Falapili Union, increasing support for labour mobility schemes, not without its challenges, but a response to the asks of Pacific countries. Increasing support for education, for civil society, a cable resilience centre, support for local media production, sports as a development goal, sports as a national security dividend. More volunteers, investment forums seeking to attract business, to get political buy-in and business interest in dealing in the Pacific. An expansion of diplomatic presence, huge from Australia. The US and China, of course, seeking to increase their diplomatic presence. Minilateral activities, the Quad, the fraught Partners for the Blue Pacific, international actors banding together to identify projects that they can deliver at greater scale if they work together, which they don't always do. A record level of aid investment from Australia into the region. It just topped $2 billion. Last year, it was just under $2 billion. So it's big. It's big for Australia. Is it enough to meet Pacific countries' priorities? That's a different presentation. So that's what Australia is doing. It's seeking to meet those domestic political imperatives. It's seeking to meet traditional development priorities. It's seeking to support civil society. This forum here today, for example, is supported by the Australian government so that we can critically analyse Australian policy, other policies, the challenges of the region. It's seeking to do as many things as possible. But if you get the picture that Australia is in a development race or an influence race or it's jumping through hoops, we have to remember who's holding the hoops. Pacific countries take strategic decisions, make strategic choices routinely. At a conference in Suva a few months ago, one of the panelists said, "Friends to all can be a foreign policy, but it cannot be a national security policy." The Pacific Policing Initiative, lots to discuss there, so I won't even start. But just to say that it is a huge step forward in terms of sharing resources, sharing sovereignty among Pacific countries, collaborating in a practical way on regional security challenges. Yes, there are diplomatic dividends. Yes, geopolitical competition probably helped Australia collect the resources in the bidding war, that is the budget allocation process in Canberra. But it's a response to a Pacific ask, and it's a moment when Pacific countries can more actively cooperate with each other, integrating their security, their national security activities with regional security needs. We'll see how it shakes out over the next 12 months as Pacific countries engage in their national consultation process. If it flops, it flops. I think I've covered everything, actually, just by skipping a bunch of pages. So it really makes you think what you plan to say and what you feel you need to say. I think this session is a great opportunity for my understanding, my perspectives to be tested, to be challenged. I think something that is difficult to talk about, because we all have equities, is what is the role of Pacific political leadership in setting the pace of geopolitical competition, in firing the starting gun, in setting out the course that larger partners are running along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail, for sharing with us. Now, our next speaker is Ge, who is finishing her PhD at the University of Adelaide. And Ge's PhD project examines China's engagement with Pacific Island countries in the past 50 years from a post-structuralist perspective. And he's the first to apply a non-state-centric approach to analyze Chinese role, interest, and the power relationship with Pacific Island countries. So we look forward to your presentation. Thank you, Ge.
Well, thank you so much, Denghua. But first, I would like to say I'm still doing my PhD, not finishing my PhD. I wish I'm finished. Actually, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So if I want to, this one. Good morning, everyone. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Adelaide. Today I'm going to discuss China's understanding of the Blue Pacific from a post-structuralist perspective. But before my presentation, I would like to thank Denghua for the great opportunity to be here today, and also for the team behind the SOP conference. It's been fantastic. And I apologize, there are some information and the details I can't share with you today because this presentation is based on one of my empirical chapters, so I'm still working on my thesis. I'll start here. In September 2017, the 48th Pacific Island Forum, in this meeting, Pacific leaders proposed the idea of the Blue Pacific framework as the core driver of collective action and a long-term foreign policy commitment, to act as Blue Continent, which calls for deeper Pacific regionalism for Pacific people. Ever since then, scholars have observed the United States, along with its allies and friends, they have already adopted this narrative. Given the persuasive nature of narrative, one might expect China would use the narrative in a similar manner to advantage its strategic in the region, especially the strategic narrative, and the actors usually use them to construct a meaning and legitimize their course of action. But there is little evidence to show that China has adopted the Blue Pacific narrative yet. And this puzzle leads to my research question in this chapter is how is it possible that China has not adopted this narrative in the same manner yet? So in today's presentation and also my thesis, I use a post-structuralist perspective to understand the China-Pacific relations, also to look into China's understanding of the Blue Pacific. So put simply, this approach is a non-state-centric, and my focus is on power knowledge instead of understanding power as a pure material concept or ideational factor. So today I argue that China is not a unitary actor, and in case you don't know that, I actually spent 3 good years of my life and trying to understand this question in my thesis. China is not a unitary actor in the region, and also today, I'm going to show you through my presentation that China's identity as a maritime power is performatively linked to its foreign policy towards Pacific Island countries. And my presentation just includes 2 parts, and I'll show you in a way that's backwards to support my argument. So that's definitely backwards. Yeah. And so first one, we need to look into the preconditions of the Blue Pacific narrative in China's context. And knowing the preconditions would help us to understand the boundary within which Chinese actors can demonstrate their power in the Chinese setting. So in 2018, Xi Jinping held a collective meeting with 8 Pacific leaders, and they have already established diplomatic relations with China. In this meeting, Xi supported the Blue Pacific along with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. And in terms of the 2050 Blue Pacific strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, she also showed a similar attitude and claimed that China fully respects the unity and the self-reliance of Pacific Island countries. But other Chinese diplomats in the region, they also try to align this Belt and Road initiative with Blue Pacific, and they aim to establish a closer China-Pacific Island countries community with a shared future. But how does China actually link its identity as a maritime power performatively through its foreign policy towards Pacific Island countries. Now I'm going to use a small case, briefly discuss the Pintan Declaration. So in April 2017, Chinese State Oceanic Administration proposed the idea of building the Blue Partnership. And 2 months later, Chinese delegates at the first UN conference used a very similar idea, and they tried to advocate for conversing marine ecosystems and tackling climate change. So we can see there's a certain level of overlap between the Blue Pacific and the Blue Partnership. So in September of the same year, China organized a Pintan of the meeting between China and the island country, oceanic-related roundtable meeting in Pintan, Fujian. And in this meeting, China invited delegates from Samoa, Fiji, Vanuatu, and Niue to attend it. And China tried to develop the Blue Partnerships with several Pacific Island countries, but after the Pintan Declaration, actually these were not formalized. So this is one side of the story, and if we take China like a non-unitary actor in the region, now let's look into other important actors in these power relations. And before 2 meetings before the Pintan Declaration, we can see Fujian province emerged itself as an important actor in this story. So the governor of Fujian province and other local officials, they considered this Blue Pacific as openness, inclusiveness, pragmatism, and a win-win approach. And they consider themselves as a core area in this 21st century maritime Silk Road, and they saw Fujian's strategic positions getting more and more important in this initiative. Meanwhile, they tried to promote local fishery industry and local tourism with Pacific Island countries. And then, additionally, we look into Chinese domestic actors' perspective, and some of them actually suggested China to establish these multiple-level Blue Partnerships with several Pacific Island countries, such as they can, under the Belt and Road Initiative, they can build the China-Oceania South Pacific Blue Economic Corridor, and China and the Pacific Island countries can work on several areas, such as the deep sea mining. But other Chinese scholars, they actually suggest China should prioritize the blue carbon protection and trying to avoid joining into the Indo-Pacific strategy. Last but not least, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also proposed the idea to establish the China-Pacific Island countries Climate Change Cooperation Center, and he saw this act as a move to support Blue Pacific and also Blue Partnership. But also in the same meeting, Wang Yi addressed the idea Japan's planning to release its Fukushima wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. And initially, Pacific leaders share the same concern, but some of them over the time have modified their stance, such as Micronesia, state of Micronesia, sorry. And so in this story, we can see in my conclusion, and I'm trying to show you, China is not a unitary actor in the region, but China, there are so many different Chinese domestic actors. They are involved in these China-Pacific relations, and also they have competing interests in their domestic society. But China is trying to act as a unitary actor, and also China doesn't have a consensus on this Blue Pacific from its domestic view. And meanwhile, China's trying to promote its own Blue Pacific, but China's taking the risk to marginalize the Blue Pacific. And that's all I want to share with you today. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gui. And our last speaker is Mana Temaketua, who is doing the PhD with us, the Department of Pacific Affairs. And Mana has degrees in geopolitics and public law. And he has worked in the sectors including export and tourism. And now I hand over to you now, Mana. Thank you.
Yaronatato. Wawareiro. Happy to be here. My name is Mana, I come from Tahiti. And today I'm going to share some thoughts on France's relations with our region. It's maybe a good idea to have notes. Okay, to start the presentation, one quick, maybe interesting fact. Did you know that France is probably one of your neighbor country in the region? Indeed, France shares a maritime border with 10 Pacific Island countries. And yet these invisible borders coincide with a contested sovereignty. France's anchorage stems from 4 territories under its flag, 3 kingdoms of Wallis and Futuna, 2 advanced autonomies, French Polynesia, Maohinui, and Kanaki, New Caledonia, and an uninhabited rock, Clipperton, La Passion, in the North Pacific. In terms of geography, these dependencies account for roughly a fourth of the total EEZ of the PIF members. They have a certain proximity with key allies such as Australia, the US, but also key passages, as it was mentioned. They're also very close to some choke points. In terms of development, there are roughly over 500,000 populations, and mainly in French Polynesia and New Caledonia. And yeah, with skilled workforce and thanks to socio-economic, modern socio-economic infrastructures. This is for the promotion for foreign investment. Nevertheless, France's relations with the PIF members have been quite delicate, especially back in the 80s. Just to help you situate in purple. Exactly. Back in the 80s, you probably heard about the protests against nuclear testing in French Polynesia, where I come from, but also the tensions in New Caledonia, the so-called events from 84 to 88. Could you give me just 1 minute? I just take my laptop. Because I see that my notes are not updated. Once again, please. Very professional. So yeah, against the backdrop of anti-colonial riots in New Caledonia between 84 and 88, the PIF supported the reinstatement of the New Caledonia on the list of non-self-governing territories to be decolonized in 86. In the late 90s, France made diplomatic efforts to improve its standing in our region, with some success. However, recent political developments in New Caledonia, which were meant to update the relationship between France and New Caledonia, are once again calling into question France's acceptance in the region. This presentation will examine the merits of and the objectives and the barriers of France's engagement with the Pacific Island countries. So how does France contribute to regional advancement? France has developed synergies with Pacific Island countries from the logistical platforms of the French dependencies and based on the common challenges with the rest of the region. France's main value proposition for the region, which it understood earlier than most of its peers, is its involvement with climate change. Through their own declarations on climate change in 2015, New Caledonia and French Polynesia helped to communicate regional concerns to the French state. Following the fourth France-Oceania Summit, which allowed for some collective preparation, COP21 led to the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. This is the only universal and legally binding climate treaty that sets the 1.5 degree target. To support the climate commitments of its partners, the French Development Agency, AFD, is allocating 200 million euros from 22 to 27 under the Kiwa initiative, with the participation of French scientific institutions. In a context of climate and environmental disruption, France's world-class armed forces are finding a new raison d'etre, a new purpose, with roughly 2,700 soldiers stationed in New Caledonia and French Polynesia. Low-intensity operations are being carried out in the region in cooperation with regional partners. Together, they provide disaster relief through the France Agreement, combat illegal fishing with Quad partners, and event conduct patrolling missions in East Asia. But why is France stepping up its regional engagement? As the last European actor that is active in our region, France has been established for more than a century. This longevity is essentially linked to great power competitions, from the Anglo-French rivalry in the 19th century to the Cold War and now the Indo-Pacific era. Apart from legitimizing its presence in the region, France's diplomacy in the Pacific seeks to build a critical diplomatic mass, given that the region is home to a pool of 7% of UN members with relatively small population. Indeed, France aspires to mobilize regional partners on multilateral agendas related to oceans, environment, climate, of course, and security issues. Paris is also attempting to counterbalance Chinese influence, but also to de-escalate great power competition. This is why the French Pacific Commander, Al-Pasi, based in Papeete, maintains social exchanges with Chinese and American counterparts. How are France's relations with Pacific Islands hampered? Because of course, this relationship is not perfect. France's engagement with Pacific Island countries is under financial constraints. Oh, maybe I forgot a few. Under several financial constraints given its global orientation and slow economic growth. In fact, the 3 billion yearly burden of its dependencies diverts official development assistance, ODA, to independent countries in the region. Indeed, the French territories have artificial economies. This is due to development plans which, despite the support of the French state and AFD, has not been very fruitful. 15 to 30% of their GDP depends on budgetary support from the French state. The main challenge, however, is an immaterial level. It's the anti-colonial defiance. In the wake of recent political turbulence in New Caledonia, The PIF has sent a mission in 2022 to assess the controversial 2021 referendum, while another will attempt to mediate the current political stalemate in Nouméa. France could also face internal disagreements. Since 2023, both French Polynesia and New Caledonia are represented in the Pacific Island Forum by pro-independence leaders, Louis Mapou and Mr. Broderson that we saw earlier today. Their full membership of the PIF was conditional on their ability to participate independently in the PIF's decision-making process. Well, when self-determination is raised with the counterparts, trust between local authorities, these local executives, and central government, Paris, is put to the test. While in the 90s, some Pacific countries, including Australia and New Zealand, were more confrontational about France's action. Today, their reactions seem more measured, given the promise of benefits mentioned earlier. The exception is maybe the position of Vanuatu's Prime Minister, Charlotte Sarwai, who publicly condemned the reform of the provincial electoral list. This position runs counter to the renewed diplomatic attention paid by France to Vanuatu, the closest neighbor of New Caledonia, where the Secretariat of the Micronesian Spearhead Group is based. In conclusion, as we can see, there is a clear articulation between local and national inclinations, political inclinations. France's territorial claims serve as a springboard for its Pacific policy, but also as an obstacle in its relations with its Pacific partners. In the context of growing international insecurity, France would like to position itself as a multilateral coordinator of common goods. But beyond normative power, it needs credibility. The operationalization of the French Indo-Pacific strategy, launched since 2018, must be translated into local benefits to avoid the idea of being conceived solely along geostrategic lines. In the battle for influence, the French authorities hope to manufacture consent around France's place in our region. However, the massive destruction caused by the riots in New Caledonia is undermining 2 decades of patient diplomatic investment. To capitalize on any relational capital it may have to build up with the Pacific Island countries, France needs to cultivate its legitimacy through its Pacific-led contribution to the region, but also through the regularization of the decolonization process. Marut Farora, merci pour votre attention. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mana. And before we open the floor, I just want to ask our panelists one difficult question. Yeah. So we start with a similar question for our traditional development partners, US, Australia, and France. So talking about China in the Pacific, in your view, does your country, US, Australia, and France, have the red lines for China's engagement with the region? For example, what areas countries think China should not touch? Yeah. So, and oh, sorry, you have some time to prepare because I have a different question for Geyi, our speaker in China, because you're talking about Chinese not a unitary actor in the region, and we know some Chinese provinces, they are leading Chinese provincial diplomacy in the region, such as Fujian province you've mentioned. So can you elaborate a little bit on those main provinces in China, and what are their respective strengths? So why they are leading the provincial diplomacy with the region? Now we start with Kenneth. Does the U.S. have have any red lines for Chinese engagement with the region, especially in Micronesia? Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, so yeah, I think any form of military engagement with the countries in Micronesia would be the hugest no-no for the United States. As it currently stands, if you look at the 3 countries, 2 of them recognize Taiwan, but Micronesia recognizes People's Republic of China. And so that is allowed under, their sovereign, they have the sovereign decision-making to be able to do that. But the strategic denial, any threat to strategic denial, so business interests, that's okay, but anything military would be a huge, the United States would go to hell and high water to prevent that from ever happening. And they will argue that, it obviously can't be allowed under the Compacts of Free Association. With Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, that's not a problem that the United States ever has to deal with because we do not control our own foreign affairs. So yeah, that's the biggest thing in Micronesia would be forms of military engagement. If they hear any inkling that anybody in Micronesia wants to do forms of military engagement, that would be sort of the largest red line, I think.
Denghua, we agreed that it would be yes/no questions, but this isn't what I had in mind. I don't think Australia sees the region or that it would be a viable decision point to identify or seek to identify red lines. Australia's relations with Pacific countries, they're underpinned by the fact that Pacific countries have their own sovereignty. There's this effort through diplomatic engagement, both at regional level and bilateral level, to seek to come to a common understanding between Australian and individual and regional Pacific countries, conceptions of security, of global security, of regional security, national security. That it's a lot less exciting than a red line decision point, but the Pacific as a region belongs to Pacific countries, not to Australia, right? It's nobody's lane, but Pacific countries, it's more like a spaghetti bowl, really, rather than a single lane. But so I don't think that's helpful. And I mean, it's a good question, but I don't think that's a helpful way of looking at it.
Do you think for Paris, does Paris care about or very concerned about the Chinese engagement with the French territories in the region in some particular areas?
Of course, definitely. In particular, in the economic area, this is identified as a key, and as it was mentioned in my presentation, a key sort of weakness of these territories. They're very reliant on their external partners. And so, yeah, there are, I believe, two elements in that direction. You saw 4 years ago, President Macron vetoing a massive fishing farm project in Hao, in the Tuamotu archipelago in French Polynesia. While it wasn't of its in the realm of his own power to do so, he overtly opposed and raised the finger and pointed at the so-called Chinese threat. And something along that line seemed to be also shaping in the New Caledonian context, where the French state is willing to redirect the nickel export, the main export product of New Caledonia, which is right now rather oriented toward Northeast Asia, South Korea, Japan, and mainly China, toward Europe instead. In the coming decades, that will be the plan that Paris would like to prevent any Chinese involvement with the local economies.
Thank you, Mana. And now, Tia Gui.
Thank you, Denghua, for your question. And I would like to say there are three major provincial actors who are involved in the Pacific from China's perspective, which included Guangdong, Fujian, and Shandong provinces in China. And so Fujian has a long tradition to have lots of Chinese diasporas in the region. And also Guangdong is kind of similar reason, and we can track back to the history back to the Qing dynasty, and we can see lots of people from Guangdong or Canton province migrated to the Pacific region back then for doing their own business, and they usually we call them old Chinese migrants in the region, right? And but recent years we can see Guangdong, they are involved in the Pacific and sent lots of medical teams in the Pacific countries, but it's quite interesting. Recently, I found out not just Guangdong is doing this sending medical teams to the Pacific, but also other cities like Chongqing, they're doing it now. And also another province, Guizhou, is also involved in this act. But another thing is Shandong, which I don't think they have a long tradition to be involved in the Pacific, but interestingly, there's a university in Shandong province. They are actually, despite they're not a top-ranking university, but they find there's a research gap in China's regional studies, and they found actually not so many people doing the research on the Pacific studies, and they started this research center. And now they provide quite a lot ideas to policymakers and political commentators. So that's it. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the floor is open, and we want to ensure we reserve enough time for questions. So the floor is open. So we have a question from English? No? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Unfortunately, we only have one microphone.
Thank you. So we can take two questions at a time. Okay. And also second question from Michael. Yeah.
Thank you. They were all very diverse and interesting presentations. My question is for Guy, and it's to follow up on the question of the autonomy that a lot of provinces are demonstrating. I guess my question is, to what extent is there any strategic coordination of those provinces, or are they acting very independently? Particularly given the different strata, say like Chongqing being involved, it's really quite interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the second question from Michael. So please identify yourself.
Yes, that's me.
Very papers all round, but just from the DFAT perspective, I was having a chat earlier with some people, and the lack of undergraduate teaching on the Pacific in Australia outside this important institution that we're sitting in now, which is an obvious exception, is presumably a concern that DFAT should be engaging with in terms of people-to-people relations and so on. I mean, these are big questions that the whole panel is discussing. And, outside this, we are all together because we have something in common, an interest in the Pacific, and see it as such an important region for so many reasons, not just geostrategic, but, the state of affairs in Pacific teaching is a parlous in this country. And, I almost think it's something that DFAT should be concerned about. I'd just like your comments on that. Excluding ANU, of course.
Thank you. Now, Guy and Mihai, please respond. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your question. And to answer your question briefly, I think there's a certain level of autonomy of each provincial actors who are involved in the Pacific, and also even including Chongqing City. But also, in terms of strategic coordination, I'm actually not sure about that. I would like to say it's more like strategic competition between Chinese domestic actors, actually. For example, the Belt and the Road Initiative. they will try to find their important role in this initiative and also other initiatives. And China's own vision of the multipolar international order, and each provincial actor, they need to find its own important role and their own interpretation of its position in this order. So I think, but also you can see a certain level of coordination. Sometimes, for example, like a few years ago, Tonga had a tsunami which triggered by that volcanic eruption triggered by tsunami, right? And Guangdong back then sent a medical team to Tonga and also sent all these disaster relief goods, which turned out some of them almost useless to Tonga. And Guangdong back then didn't do their homework properly, didn't find what Tonga really needed. So, but also, from their perspective, but Guangdong can boost itself, like I'm a good player in this game. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I think it was former Prime Minister Scott Morrison who started using the term Australia as part of the Pacific family. And I imagine that was quite surprising to a lot of people in the Pacific region. I think it was equally surprising to people in Australia. Now, it's easy to make fun because obviously there's that's more of an aspirational statement, I think. There's a gap between where our diplomacy is, where our regional security interests are, where our policy focus is, and where Australians think Australia is. Education is absolutely vital. It's a tough one because you can't just bang the drum and say you should care about this, because everyone's doing that for their own patch. It's something that needs to be organic, and undergrad's a great place, probably even before that, early education. And I think the same would go for First Nations, as a collective of issues. Australians don't know their own history sufficiently well, and geography's pretty poor as well.
Thank you. And yeah, Nick in the middle, or you can speak up. Yeah.
I can yell if that's okay.
Thank you, Nick. And one more question from here. Okay.
Thank you. Nick McClellan from Islands Business Magazine. Mihai made a passing reference to America and its allies responding to China's shift in policy. And I wonder if a couple of the commentators could actually talk about the timing of this. To put it bluntly, who started this? Because for me, there's a real question about what historical time frame you're looking at. The basis in Guam is 1898. The overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy is 1893 to 1898. So it depends where you start as to who started the thing. And I wonder if people could comment more about the synergies of the response, ramping up or ramping down conflict. Because I don't actually think it's a matter of who started it, because that's determined by your time frame. It's more about how do actions by one create counteractions by another, and then that leads to escalation. But frankly, I've been writing a lot about the French and the notion that, it's the Chinese who started the stuff in New Caledonia or Azerbaijan, or I'm old enough to remember the Libyans, I'm sorry. It started in 1853. So I wonder if you could comment, those that are willing to, about timeframes and the synergies of how call and response create this.
Hi. My question is, there's one big question, but it's kind of in two small parts. I want to hear more about Taiwan and the fact that there are a few Pacific island countries, Tuvalu, Palau, and the Marshall Islands, that recognize Taiwan. If there is going to be one day a US-China conflict, I think there's a big debate in international relations. Might end up being a bit of another Cold War. I'm not an expert on that, but if there is that sort of conflict in the future, how important will Taiwan and the Pacific in that area be, especially considering the amount of military action that happens with Taiwan? What do you think is the future for diplomatic recognition of Taiwan? And how important do you think that'll be to all Pacific states, but also particularly the freely associated states? Just a very small extra thing, sorry. Is there, with a red line, do you think that will be something that happens with Taiwan and China? Do you think that one exists, even if you think it's not worth defining it? That there will be a point that it's like, this has gone too far, now we're going to do things?
Both questions. So anyone want to?
All right, I'll have a crack. Who started it? That's an excellent point. And I often wonder where I should start my presentation in terms of who started it. And if I could just park that, and I think really this is an opportunity, a moment in time when Pacific countries are visibly asserting their agency. I don't want to overstep on the next presentation, but not to say that it doesn't matter or that unresolved, that the past is the past. I think you need to address history and recognize where we are as a result of what's happened before. But in terms of action, there is, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but obviously the Pacific as a region is under intense pressure, not just from geopolitics. That is one, that's what we're talking about today, but many others. There's an opportunity to take all of this energy, all of this interest, all of these resources that policymakers are busy scrounging together, and to take action on things that are not going to wait for us to resolve who started it. For storytelling purposes, you got to pick a starting point. But there is no real finish point, and unresolved history will continue to be a part of living culture forever. And I think one way to better address that is to better inform our diplomacy with each other. Little humble steps is what we've seen from the Australian government in recent years in terms of establishing an ambassador for First Nations, for example. But there's obviously a lot more work that can be done with that role, with that team, with thinking about how to incorporate First Nations principles into Australian diplomacy. I think that'll connect with notions of who started it. And I think it'll connect with what actions do we need to take now. Obviously, they're not all going to be hard security actions. A lot of it is about culture and identity and memory. And that's impacted by geopolitical competition as much as climate change and economic and social pressures. That's just a rambling sort of reflection on that, Nick. I thought it was going to be much tougher, but that's a pretty tough question from you. I'll have a crack at the Taiwan thing because it's way outside of my area of expertise, so why not? I've got the microphone. Those are all really excellent questions, and I think that strategic planners and security analysts around the world are trying to pin down exactly firm answers to those questions. How would it play out? What would be the cascade of effects? What level of cost can we tolerate in exchange for a new status quo? Those answers are also political, so I don't think you'll get decision makers volunteering them, but I think internally they're also really devilishly hard to quantify. And that's why people are tense. I mean, we talk about strategic tension. It is tension. It's also physically felt. The degree of uncertainty is what makes this so tricky. Overcorrecting can precipitate a counter correction. Undercorrecting can introduce new and unforeseen threats. Yeah, red lines. You know, in some ways, we had a session yesterday on AUKUS, but if you think of different activities and different diplomatic engagements as a reaction to threat perceptions, you know, maybe in some ways, some red lines have already been crossed. Australia's huge investment into AUKUS at 368 billion or so, that's crossed someone's red line to identify that huge package of funds for that activity. It changes what people think is necessary to feel safe in the region. Maybe it's like a red fog rather than a single line. Any other panelists wish to? Yeah.
I'll go with the Taiwan question. We're actually following that very closely in Guam. The Center for Strategic and International Studies did an iteration of 24 war games. In each of the 24, regarding an amphibious invasion of Taiwan by China, Guam is attacked. So that's our reality. And so, you know, we've come up with this phrase, as goes Taiwan, as goes Guam, right? And that's what we're doing here. And so my presentation was trying to show is that vulnerability of Guam is now leading to the United States trying to have these other locations within Micronesia. Now, another thing that I'll mention is when the United States is trying to figure out what to do now that the INF treaty is no more, where can they put ground-based intermediate range missiles? Think tanks, United States think tanks are saying, you know what, if Japan won't host it, that's the most ideal situation, is for the allies to host it. But if Japan, for example, won't host it, we always have the freely associated states who can barely say no, or Guam, or the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. So if it comes to Taiwan, we're going to be dragged into that no matter what. Now, to the other question that Nick was mentioning about a starting point and who started it, for me, you know, I feel like it's this. They're like, how many Fast and the Furious movies? I feel like we've just been changing the villain in each of these movies, but it's like the same, we're expected to react and relate to the same characters, but you just shift it from Japan to the Soviet Union to China. We've just been consistently following the same script over and over again. And, you know, this was a point where for Micronesia, the script has remained the same, you know, not the case for all of Oceania. For example, the U.S. originally had plans to blanket all of the South Pacific with bases and to claim any island that we, the Americans, have shed blood in. But when strategic considerations were changed and said, oh, Japan's no longer the threat, it's actually the Soviet Union, that's when they said, okay, we're just going to make sure that we get places like Okinawa, Hawaii, Micronesia, right? So for us in Micronesia, we are watching the next iteration of the Fast and Furious movie and just hoping that it doesn't the car doesn't come out of the screen and hit us again. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I just briefly add something on that Taiwan issue. And thank you for the question. But I think first I'll ask another question by answering question, which is something I hate to do that. But why do we have to take great power competition as the core of international relations? Why do we have to take it? And why can't we take it great power responsibility, moral duty as the core of international relations? Why that's not the case? And also, in terms of Taiwan, I think, well, as the current leader, Lai denied the 92 consensus. I think, although Taiwan issue is not my specialty, I'll just briefly add something, okay? So, but by denying that consensus, I think it actually wouldn't have the bargaining chips with China to talk about Taiwan's position. It'll make Taiwan's position become harder and harder in the negotiation. And also, China's trying to do like win your minds and hearts of Taiwan, but it's pretty hard to do that at the moment. As you mentioned, the culture and the memory. At the moment, the younger generation in Taiwan, in China, actually don't have the shared culture and memory, especially the identity. The younger generation in Taiwan, they deny they are even like ethnic Chinese, most of them. So that's pretty hard to share the culture and the memory between Taiwan Straits. And also Taiwan thinking about its own democracy. Last week, its oppositional leader, Convenor, was arrested under the name of corruption, which we don't know if he's corrupted or not, but we need to think about Taiwan's democracy as well, right? So that's hopefully answer your question. Thank you so much.
That's fine. Okay, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for this amazing discussion. I'm Chris Kaloufis from the Institute for Space here at ANU. My question's inspired by Ken and your discussion about the way that the terminology becomes a reality for yourselves in Micronesia. And if you were sitting in front of a military planner, a strategist, a policymaker, and you had an opportunity to describe the implications of those words, and particularly when I think about dispersal, resilience in our national defence strategy in Australia, and talking about our northern approaches and how that we're taking a new approach to logistics in the north of Australia, what would you say to somebody who was operationalising that, implementing that?
Yeah, because we take 2 questions at a time. Okay, the middle, please. Thank you.
Sorry, hello. Caitlin Ryan, I'm from the Asia Pacific Group on Money Laundering. Just wanted to know what you thought the role of multilateral organisations would be in this kind of slowing down, this kind of feeling of inevitability towards military conflict in the region. Is there a role, or is that just completely irrelevant?
Okay.
All right, that's a great question. If I have that audience, number one, sometimes I get very confused by things like that, because when they say dispersal, distribution, resilience, all of these words, I mean, they're coming at it from a particular worldview that often we don't share, right? And so that's why, for me, why we started the Pacific Center for Island Security was to learn that language and speak to them in their own language. So, for example, missile defense in Guam, the integration of all of these multiple systems, we've had the Department of Defense Office of Testing and Evaluation themselves call these things, well, you have a lot more work to do, right? The integration still has a lot of problems. You're looking at sustainment challenges. And so, I'm not necessarily answering your question as much as showing the importance of understanding their lingo themselves, right? Because if we don't understand that lingo and we come at it from a social justice perspective, that often falls upon deaf ears, right? When you have a military planner who's trying to say, this is why we want to use your island, well, they're not going to really appeal to the fact that you're an indigenous peoples. That's just the way it is, right? And so I think if I had an audience, I would try my best to examine each and every plan they have and point out potential flaws in the strategic thinking that has occurred. But quite frankly, that's a hard task, right? It's a hard task, but I think it's something that needs to be done. And so, yeah, that's how I would address that. Thanks.
How to address it? In the case of France, it is obvious that with all its goodwill, it is trying to uphold the status quo, the post-45 corpus of international bodies, and it is one of the reasons why it is involved in our region, apart from the attempt to legitimize its presence. It is also aiming to recruit diplomatic support as other geopolitical players, I suppose. And try to set more ambitious agenda collectively.
Thank you. And we may have time for one last question if you have. If not, please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their insight about Southwest. So thank you so much. Thank you.